One day it will stop minimizing everything on second screens when I start sharing. So we can hope that'll come sooner rather than later. So anyways, yes, thanks, Gavin. We're here to talk about some actions for governing Power BI. Hang on one second. I don't know why. Hang on a second. This is my first presentation since upgrading to Windows 11. And interestingly, see how my toolbar is covering up the bottom part of the slides. So that's bothering me, but we're going to forge ahead nonetheless. And actually, I wonder if I can hide that. One second, because that's just going to bother me this whole time. Where's the auto hide? Okay. Let's make that go away, make it look a little better. Awesome. So as Gavin said, I'm Melissa Coates, and what makes me a little bit different from most Power BI people is that I more specialize in the governance administration side of things. And if you asked me a complex DAX question, there's no way in the world I'm going to be able to help you. Like you said, I have done a lot of technical writing for Microsoft. We're going to talk about one of them, which is the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. There's also a thing called planning a Power BI enterprise deployment. And very exciting, that is something that we're actively working on updating right now. So more news on that soon. But we'll have some new gifts for the community here in coming weeks and months. And then besides writing for Microsoft, the other big thing that I spend most of my time on these days is an online course. So as you can probably imagine, what we're going to talk about today is just a tiny sliver of what we talk about there. If I go back to the main page for just a second here, though, I want to point out at the bottom on my website, on the presentations page, if you want to grab a copy of these slides, there's a PDF there that you are more than welcome to download. So the Coates DS or Coates Data Strategies all spelled out, .com/presentations. All right, so what we have planned for today, this is a pretty high level conversation, a little bit more about strategy and planning. So if you were hoping that we're going to crack open tenant settings and talk exactly about what to set, that's not really the kind of session that we're talking about. We're really talking more about the kinds of things that you want to think about when you're governing Power BI. I'm also making a few assumptions that you're using Power BI, you're familiar with it, you know that there's some areas of improvement. So having said all that, I'm not going to cover fundamentals. In the chat, Gavin and Catherine are going to help watch for questions. If you need me to pause and double back and elaborate a little bit more on something, I'm happy to do that. Just toss it in the chat. Where I actually want to start is the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. And you might say, wait a second, adoption, I thought this was a governance session. Well, let me explain what I mean. So the Adoption Roadmap is a series of articles that we wrote, and it's basically this set of considerations that lead to a successful Power BI adoption. And if I pop over to it real quick, each one of the boxes on this diagram relates to one article. So each one we go into at least a little bit of conversation about things to think about. And so things we talk about in this session here are purposefully going to overlap with this quite a bit. Now, the sequencing of these 10 things is not perfect, but the whole idea behind it is we want to understand our data culture first. We're going to talk about that more here in just a little bit. You need an executive sponsor to make sure you've got support to get things done. We're going to talk a little bit more in this session about understanding how content's owned, managed, and delivered around the organization, because those things matter a lot for our governance decisions. This item 5 here is the Center of Excellence, and we're actually not going to talk about that a lot, but that's a major factor in getting things done, particularly down here, 7, 8, and 9, which are all about your community and user support. We're going to revisit that a little bit. But what I meant a moment ago about the Center of Excellence, I don't personally care that much if you formally have a Center of Excellence on the org chart in your organization, as long as somebody is taking care of all of the important things and your users know who to go to. All right, so I'm going through all of these pieces briefly just to kind of make one or really two huge points. You see governance down here is number 6. And the reason that it's there, and again, the sequencing isn't perfect, but the reason that it's there is that we can't actually govern until we have a whole lot of this information in place first. And then governance, those decisions and policies, processes, guidelines, whatever you call that sort of thing, impacts the system oversight. And in the Power BI adoption roadmap, we call it system oversight, and really we just mean Power BI administration. System oversight is just a little bit more palatable for managers reading the documentation and that sort of thing. But if we go back now to the slides, the focus of that roadmap is on what we call organizational adoption. And there's 3 kinds of adoption. The first one is the big one that we're focusing on with that roadmap, and the big one that we care about mostly from a governance perspective, because that's where we're talking about we can actually govern and manage our data well. And when we do that, that means we can actually enable our BI efforts well. Now, everybody likes to use the term user adoption, and that's fine. For purposes of the adoption roadmap, we are saying what that means is more about, yeah, it is absolutely being actively used, but in an effective way and in a way how people continually get better and they know more, so they do things better. And then the third one down here, solution adoption, is super important, right? This specific solution that you're deploying does what it promised to do. It delivers value, et cetera, et cetera. There is impact. So as you can imagine, they are all super, super interrelated. The big point here is that adoption is about way more than just usage. Adoption is about doing things in an effective way, which is a really vague, high-level term. I get that. But if so far you have been thinking about adoption as more usage, think about it from this perspective that if we get tons and tons of duplicate data models or tons and tons of downloads and exports to Excel, et cetera, that's not saying that we have achieved adoption of Power BI, right? Yeah, it's usage, but it's not the good kind of usage necessarily. All downloads and all exports are not bad. So to kind of round out this first piece, what I would suggest, if you are not familiar with it yet, is to really first just review it end to end and start thinking about what your current state is for each one of those areas and be just brutally honest, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the best way to do that is with these maturity levels that we put into the adoption roadmap. Now, I'm going to give you a quick review of these 5 levels, but I do want to preface it by saying what we put in the adoption roadmap are very, very generic. Almost everybody that uses the roadmap for your organization, you're going to have to customize them, right? And say, what does level 200 mean for me in this particular area? So just kind of use them as a general guide. But if we start at the very bottom, level 100 is basically the starting point where things are either brand new or what we would think of as informally handled. And good things can happen at this level, but the good things that are happening are really reliant on somebody having good judgment and good experience because it's inconsistent and it's undocumented. So when we get to level 200, we've made a purposeful effort to standardize and improve and document. So things might not be happening uniformly across the whole organization yet, but we are making inroads to that and making things more repeatable. By the time we get to 300, this is a big level because now we really have this approved governance plan. We have focus, we have objectives, and we are far more consistent across the entire organization. And we have things like roles and responsibilities defined and so forth. By the time we get to 400, that's when we're starting to do really well with lessons learned. And, we can make improvements and we can scale those lessons around the org. And we're also very, very clear on where does Power BI fit in our overall BI strategy for the organization, right? Because it's just one tool. And so we really know what it takes to achieve our goals about adoption, data culture, governance, all those things that have hooks into each other. And then the last level 500, we've gotten really good at making sure that what we're doing aligns with business objectives. So we've got these measurable goals. We've got key performance indicators. We have automation in place where possible, right? Here we're running on all cylinders. So here's where it gets really tricky though. We've got these 5 levels and maybe we do an assessment and we kind of end up with saying for the organization as a whole, let's say we're at 300, which is really pretty good, by the way. Maybe we start then analyzing some individual business units or large departments, however it is in your org, and they, of course, are always going to be at different levels. Then we might start analyzing different capabilities, and by that I mean the 10 pieces on the adoption roadmap. And they're going to be at different levels, and you don't have to shoot for level 500 for absolutely everything. No way. You don't have the time, you don't have the people, you don't have the funding. You got to pick your battles, so to speak. So this gets tough, and that's another reason why customizing those maturity levels is important. So kind of assess where you're at, customize them, and figure out where you need to go forward with those. And with all of that, I can't do a very good job of watching the chat while I talk. So Gavin, can you let me know if there's any questions that I should handle now?
Yeah, just some general questions. So, and Chewy's asked, should data management be totally influenced by Power BI alone or defined regardless of Power BI? And then Gina has added, to build on that, what exec business roles are critical with data management buy-in outside of IT? Where might those champions be?
Okay, so I didn't actually quite hear the whole thing. I see Chewy's, though, data management be totally influenced by Power BI. And no, definitely, unless Power BI is the only BI tool in your organization. And the bigger you are, the much, much less common that is. So my position is usually to say, I'm always talking about Power BI, but in reality, these decisions that we're making are really sort of analytics as a whole. And that might include multiple BI tools. That might include some data science tools. That might include some data engineering tools. So I'm absolutely with you that yeah, this is one piece of the puzzle, but in reality, it's harder than that. And then I do see Gina's executive business roles that are critical for buy-in. That is huge. And so a lot of times we talk about executive sponsorship, and a lot of times we say, this is a person that has authority across different areas of the organization, meaning that if your sponsor is able to get things done, especially the hard things. Now, where that might be in the organization, I don't know. It might also very well be a committee. I actually need to update the adoption roadmap executive sponsorship section to make that more clear that a committee is absolutely fine as long as it's structured well and represents the different areas of the organization and so forth. So I like how you're thinking for sure. I just don't know that I have a great answer for you. So if we've assessed and if we've said we know kind of where we want to be for some of these main areas, and when I say that, I kind of mean the main areas that are on that adoption roadmap or areas that you define in our organization. This is so very important. So I want to give you two different ways to think about prioritization. The first one is almost just a little bit of an exercise. You know, if you had $100 to spend, how would you spend it? Because you would look at this page and say, absolutely, they're all important. Are they all equally important? If you say the first one, data protection, is the most important, all right, is that $50? And so it's an impossible thing to actually answer, but it's a good thing to almost challenge ourselves to say, well, we can't do it all. Do we really lean in this year or even this quarter on one particular thing and then reassess later? And then the other thing that I want to give you to think about is, where does governance come in? And so there's three common ways that this happens. So the top one is, we've rolled out Power BI. And this usually happens when licenses are freely given. And then at some point, some people in the organization are saying, hold on, we need to get some of the horses back in the barn. And so that's really difficult, because then we need to gain control over some level of chaos that has ensued. And then the second one shown here is basically the opposite of, we are going to go through an enormously in-depth planning exercise before we let anybody have Power BI. And granted, that might be justified in your particular organization. What we tend to say is a little bit more ideal is more of an iterative process, the third one shown. And this isn't perfect here, because every time we adjust something and then we have to communicate back with our users that, oh, we are adjusting something because we're being iterative, right? We're also being disruptive. So number 3 is important to do within reason. And it's all just very difficult. And by the way, you might have a combination of this also depending on different areas of your org. But really, here's the thing that I really wanted to convey, is that there's always this need usually for, let's keep improving the governance side of things. Let's also let people get things done, right? Handle those most pressing needs, and let's just continually get better where we can, when we can. So if you know what's most important, that mental exercise that we talked about a minute ago, that can help prioritize. And I tend to like to prioritize in these 4 buckets that I show here, right? The immediate, these are our fire items. What's short term, medium term, longer term? And thinking of longer term is almost like a backlog. And so how we make continual progress. Any comments that we want to address before we move on further?
No, I think just Gina was building on your metaphor of horses back to the barn.
That's actually not an expression I've ever used before. So Gina, you must have inspired it. So thank you very much. All right. So governance. What does the word governance evoke for you as a word? It usually evokes this idea of control and let's tell people what they can't do. And what I want to do is try to get you to believe that if we do this well, we can absolutely improve the user experience. And the thing is that users, they don't want to be governed. They don't want to be told what they can and can't do, although that's certainly required sometimes. But if we really approach it from this idea of user enablement, That means we can help people get things done and we can save them from headaches. So I say there are three main goals for governing self-service BI. So to Chewy's point, not just Power BI, self-service BI as a whole. The number one goal is, how do we let people be productive and efficient within the guardrails? And that's number 2 and 3, right? How do we adhere to our requirements for the proper use of data and comply with whatever regulations that we need to comply with? But if we're really transparent on what people are allowed to do, why, and how, that transparency just helps them have a better experience. So let me backtrack just a second to a definition. Because even though we're saying governance shouldn't be all about command and control, it still is this, very formal sounding definition about who can do what, when, what circumstances, what methods. We kind of can't get around that. It is all about what are the guardrails of what you can accomplish. The other thing that I want to mention, and we hinted about this at the beginning, every one of you has a little bit different way to think about what does governance really mean. And it might actually include some of these items that are surrounding it, especially if you tend to use governance and administration interchangeably. And so I'm on a little bit of a mission to get people to stop using those two terms interchangeably because they're very different. Think of governance as the guidance, the policies, the processes, and so forth to make sure that we're using data well. And think of administration as those day-to-day activities that will in turn enact the governance policies. So at this point, what we want to do is figure out what's your view of the world, and your policies, processes, guidelines have this proper balance of those three things. And some of this is strategic, some of it is far more tactical though. Literally, what's on that data policy that you're going to publish for people, or what's on the guidelines or best practices or whatever thing you publish for your folks internally to use. All right, anything we want to?
No, I think we carry on.
Perfect. So as you're figuring out what actions do we need to take, your data culture matters. And can't mention data culture without mentioning Mr. Roche. So Matthew Roche is on the Power BI CAT team. He was my reviewer for the Power BI adoption roadmap. I'm also working with him on the newest content that we're working on publishing now. So his definition of data culture is that it promotes and encourages data-driven decisions by more stakeholders in more parts of the organization. What does that sound like to you? Sounds an awful lot to me like data democratization, the third thing here. So we could talk for a whole half an hour about data discovery, data literacy, and data democratization. They're all three really big, important parts of data culture. But if we distill those definitions down to the simplest thing, data discovery helps people find the data. Data literacy means they can understand it, and data democratization means that you can use the data. All of which means that a data culture is promoting usage of the data. And you might say, well, Melissa, that is so obvious. But here's the problem. If we're talking about governance, we have this fundamental struggle between protecting the data and promoting usage of the data. And so there's this book that I really like, and there's a link to it at the end of these materials. Thank you for sharing Matthew's link as well. That link is also at the end of these materials. But this struggle is very, very real. So if you have maybe a system administrator whose natural tendency is to turn off as many things as possible because they're leaning so hard towards protecting the data, that's not necessarily wrong, but the question is it right? So if we step back to, well, what are we trying to have with our data culture? Well, we want to use data more. We want to rely on data more for decision making. And we want to do that with more stakeholders. And we want to do that with the methods and best practices. And I'm on number 3 here. And I say endorsed by the Center of Excellence or the BI team or IT, whomever is taking care of that side of things in your organization. And we want to use trusted data. And that's a big deal. We're going to touch on that here in just a little bit. And this idea of we need to adapt and learn and just get better at what we do, that whole idea of let's iteratively improve what we're doing, slow but sure. And we want to reduce culture, undocumented or tribal knowledge. If Joe is the only person that knows how to access a certain type of data, that's a risk. And the problem is we don't want analytics to be allowed by only the chosen few. And hunches, opinions, gut decisions, that sort of thing. That'll still always happen. We're human, but data-informed decisions. Hero mentalities means that's the person that is a bottleneck. They are so important to be involved, but they are so busy that the work that they do is either substandard because they're so busy, or getting what they're doing to scale out and be more meaningful can't be done. And then finally, the whole reduced reliance on command and control. So this really just is all about figuring out what's really going on. And that might involve having some interviews with people and so forth, especially if you're trying to figure out what policies you need to roll out. You might need to figure out what's really going on, because that matters a lot for these 4 factors that I'm about to cover. So this is also in the adoption roadmap. 4 factors to define the level of governance for how something is going to work. So we're going to start out with who owns and manages the content, the scope of delivery, the subject area, and then the importance or the criticality level. So let's start with this. There's actually a lot going on here. So let's break this down. The rows are who owns the data or who owns the reports. The columns, let's say a business unit like accounting, complete control of managing both the data and the reports. On the far end sides of things, the enterprise BI team or IT, for instance, they're taking responsibility for end-to-end data and reports. Now, a lot of times this idea of managed self-service BI in the middle is a lot of times what we're leaning towards, where the data is centralized and the reports are created by people out in the business units. And the reason that this is helpful, well, Microsoft calls this discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. This impacts governance decisions massively, massively. So on the left side here, we're usually talking about more flexibility, right? If they need to publish an update, they just do. And over here, we're usually talking about more oversight and something in the middle for managed self-service BI. But this is not the whole part of the story. It's just first thinking about who is managing the content and what that piece means. The piece we have to marry up to that is, well, who's it getting published to? That's what we call the scope of content delivery. Personal BI, way over here on the left, well, we're not going to impose a lot of governance decisions on personal BI because that should be for me, myself, and I. Enterprise is huge. We're going to have quite a bit more oversight. And team and departmental BI is somewhere in the middle. And you can imagine that a business-led or decentralized solution, it's being published to a small group of people, no problem. Enterprise BI publishing content to the entire org, no problem. When how about we make that a little better? When our content needs to be published to the entire organization, but it's somebody in, say, I don't know, a remote department that's asking to do that, that gets more complicated. So one thing you want to do is kind of think about, well, when that comes up, how do we handle that when we start to have mismatches between these two sides of the page? Criteria 3 is, what kind of data do we have? Because not all data is equal. Is it super sensitive? Is it regulated? Is it super confidential? And then criteria 4 is a general importance or criticality level. These are critical data elements, if you use that term in your organization, that this is really important data for our performance, our operations. Maybe it's customer facing. Maybe we've got a huge number of downstream dependencies. However you want to define it, these are just a few ideas. So those 4 things are kind of the biggies that I tend to use for, let's think about the Rubik's Cube, if you will, of how all of these things factor in to come up with, well, how do we need to govern this particular data for these sets of people? So you might not use these same 4 pieces of criteria, but hopefully these give you a few things to think about, because not every governance policy is the same. The other thing you want to think about is, well, which groups can and should actually manage their own content? So that idea of decentralized management and ownership of content. And what are they allowed to do? And how are we going to ask them to govern it? And how are we perhaps going to audit that? And what if multiple teams are involved? That middle managed self-service BI, that one is mostly what I'm talking about here. If we know that end-to-end different pieces of content are owned and managed by different people. Okay, so supporting the internal community of users. Massively important. We could spend the entire hour on just this, as you can imagine, everything I'm talking about. We could blow it out by a lot. But one of the biggest success factors for your governance initiatives is the fact that we are actually supporting and educating our internal community. So I fundamentally believe that one of the best ways that we decrease risk is to increase knowledge. Put another way, we tell people, here's why we're asking you to do what we're asking you to do. And the vast majority of the time, people will understand and will comply. And of course, you'll have your few people that don't want to, and you can deal with that. But this is huge, and I'm a really big believer in it. So the first thing I think that you want to think about is, do you need a center of excellence? And this is that group of people who are considered the experts in the org, but really they are there to help support others in the organization. They are there to nurture and mentor other people in the organization. And so the governance model is absolutely going to depend on how you handle this sort of thing. And like I mentioned much earlier, I don't really care as much if you call it a center of excellence as if you are actually handling these things, including this last one, the 4th one, which is massive. This team has what I think of as a cross-departmental view. What's happening across the organization? Because if we know, the accounting team is doing something this way, can we get the rest of the teams to do the same? And we scale out those lessons learned. That's huge, but you need somebody that has that view and has that way to interact with the different teams. And the really helpful thing is what we think of as an internal Power BI hub or a community site. And this could just be SharePoint. And that's where you've got your centralized area of documentation, links, resources, etc. And we start to slowly but surely teach people that's your home base. And then user support model, we talk about that. There's quite a bit of info on that in the adoption roadmap article. There's these kind of multiple levels of support. We don't necessarily have to invest massive resources, but we have to make sure people aren't completely on their own if we want to standardize and scale and all that kind of stuff. All right, before I push on, I need to check in and see if there's anything that we should.
Yeah, just a question. Well, a couple of questions. One from Fernando. So he's talking about the actions and everything else. And if we're managing our own content, would that imply an increase in headcount potentially? If it was personal BI, I would suspect it probably wouldn't, but maybe once it gets larger, then potentially it would. But that's probably where the COE can also help if that exists.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. I think it depends on the makeup of the people in your organization. So if you already have an organization with a lot of people that are, if not data analysts, the kinds of people that can learn those sorts of skills, then maybe their just job changes a bit over time, as opposed to an organization where, no, that just doesn't make nearly as much sense. Or it might not be skill related entirely. There's also, and I think back to a healthcare organization that was very much an enterprise BI model. They had one and only one team that was allowed to do self-service BI outside of the core BI team. And that's because everything was very, very highly governed because it's healthcare data and that sort of thing. So I basically just said it depends in a lot more words.
No, that's fine. And then Gina asked, the actions for would that be something the exec sponsor drives? And obviously they would broker that discussion between IT and the business, who may have very different views of what should may look like.
Yeah, and this is all of this kind of stuff. I completely agree that yes, your executive sponsor or equivalent can help with all of these decisions, and if not decisions, helping communicate the way that we want the world to be. Because all of this, the people stuff is hardest by far.
Yeah.
And so yes, I agree. And I like the way that you're thinking there in terms of how do we make it easier to communicate what the decisions have been. And, whether that's one executive sponsor or your data governance committee or your center of excellence, however that shakes out organizationally, which is actually a good topic. We don't have time to actually talk about what the roles and responsibilities might look like, but this is a very, very big thing. And a couple of the questions I think have kind of hinted at this. What's expected of people is important. How much flexibility do they have? What can they and can they not do? But having said that, we also need to make sure that roles and responsibilities are not set in concrete. And if we think about that, especially in bigger companies, we've got somebody that is our cowboy. That person that is going to go be so industrious and do something that we say, oh my gosh, that's crazy. What do we do about that if we don't actually like the specific actions that they're doing, but we love the fact that they're taking initiative and being industrious? There's one org I've talked to that, well, they've hired those people into the Center of Excellence, and that works too. What I want to convey with this is that we've got those first line people at the operational level, right? Think about our people sitting in the individual business units. We've got the groups in the middle that span business units, like IT, for instance, or like the Center of Excellence, probably. At the top, we've got more of the strategic level. So if we think about the bottom level, we are not telling them these, we're not doing governance at them. They are the foundation of what we're governing. So whenever we can, we want to learn what they are doing, what works well, and can we formalize that? It doesn't always work, but it does work sometimes if we're willing to do that. And then the higher levels are a little bit to Gina's point that she made a couple minutes ago. Here's where we get that authority and helping get things done across those organizational boundaries. So it's important enough, I'm going to say it again, that those people that own and manage content in the business units, those are our foundation of how we do governance well. So we do need to know who our executive sponsor is and what their role is to help us get things done around the organization. How are they going to help us solve all those pesky people issues? And we need to have our roles and responsibilities. We need to have people be clear on what we're asking of them, especially those Power BI champion type of people that produce and take responsibility for content in their group. And then a lot of times we're asking them to take on first line support of that. And that just happens naturally all the time. Joe becomes the go-to person that everybody just goes and asks questions of. And that's fine as long as Joe or Mary is amenable to that. Sometimes you might need to actually make it more formal if things aren't happening the way you really want them to. This is a quick one about just being transparent about system administration decisions. And there are a slew of things in the tenant settings that change the way Power BI behaves. And what happens is your users will read things online. What can you do with Power BI? And it just doesn't work for them. So it becomes irritating, and that might absolutely impact your adoption efforts. So what we want to avoid is having a Power BI administrator that just decides completely on their own what should or shouldn't be allowed. Something I always recommend is regularly we want to review the tenant settings. Are they set the way we want them to be? Do they have the right groups assigned, etc.? And fundamentally, what are we trying to do here? Well, what behaviors do we need to deny to a larger group of people, like certifying? We don't want to let everybody certify. That is something we do want to deny. But locking down exports, that one I don't usually agree with. What we also want to do, this one's really important, we want to document those settings for our internal community. What is the setting? Why can you or can you not do that? And if you want to be able to do it, what group do you ask for to be in? And that goes in your community hub. So then when somebody is frustrated about, why can't I, for instance, push an app to my end users and then automatically install it for them, they can see that, oh, okay, I got to be in such and such group. And they can figure out if that's something they can accomplish or not. And then if you've got a whole bunch of Power BI administrators, that's a lot of risk. You want to have 2 to 4 if possible, just to fundamentally reduce risk. And the very last topic that we're going to cover is just using our data for not only adoption monitoring, but auditing. So there is the activity log or usage log data that's available, and that's our starting point. There's a bunch of other stuff too, but that's our starting point. And this activity analysis or activity log data is massively critical. It helps us with what is being used and is not being used, and what changes were made when. This includes not only content changes, but security changes. And then, do you have to backtrack and give information to auditors? So if you have compliance needs, absolutely, you need this data. Usage is a big part of adoption. We've already talked about that, but it's not the only part. So understanding how the system's actually being used helps us with adoption efforts. And this data is a really big piece. It's gold for helping us do that. It helps us see what's happening from a trustworthy perspective. So on that presentations page, that link I gave you way at the beginning, there's another presentation that I have up. It's solely devoted to improving trustworthiness of our content. And we talk about things like shared data sets and stuff like that, certifying content. With these data, we can understand, well, what is really happening and take action on it. We can see from a licensing perspective, I've worked with a couple of clients along the way that just didn't have the ability to buy more licenses. So they had to be very careful about assigning licenses and had to carefully watch, well, if you're not using your license, it's going to be taken away from you, that sort of thing. The usage patterns, super important. Training opportunities, and this is my nice way of saying when you see things that you don't like. Somebody's doing a lot of sharing out of my workspace. This is a training opportunity. We send them some information about here's a better way. I can give you lots of examples, but you get the idea. Or even just suspicious usage, that sort of thing. So at this point, if you're not retrieving data from the Power BI activity log, that should be a priority because it is fundamentally so important for adoption, auditing, governance type of efforts. And there is an item on the Power BI release plan about getting this in a much easier way than is currently available today. Today, it's kind of a hassle for you to write your own scripts and extract your own data. It will be better in the next few months, but it's not here yet. So I'm still kind of making this recommendation with that little asterisk on it, if you will. And then just start learning. Use that activity log data with how is Power BI really being used, and then act on it. So it's once you get it running, it's easy to start grabbing the data, storing it. It takes a little bit more discipline and effort to actually analyze it and then, go do something about it. All right, so all of that means that these are my top few suggestions for a well-governed Power BI environment. We're just dipping our toes in the water, of course, as you would imagine, but this is kind of a good set of things that if you're putting effort here, I think you're in pretty good shape. So with that, we can spend the remainder of the time that we have on Q&A. And I see Gina is so excited for that roadmap item. So let me make sure you all know where that is. So let me, hang on, rehide this so I can find it. Let me plop this in the chat for you. This is the item that I was talking about, and basically what it's saying is that it's one of multiple things, but the audit log is basically going to automatically come to a dedicated workspace with the tenant-wide historical data sets and reports to monitor and govern Power BI. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the first bits of this. It looks like it's going to come in March. I'm not sure why we're not getting a public preview and it's going straight to GA. We'll see if that changes. While we have our final part of the discussion, I will put this up if anybody needs a copy of these slides. You can find them here. So anything else that we want to talk about here in our last few minutes?
Not sure. I don't think there's any other open questions. Let me... Okay, so just take themselves off mute and ask. Oh, okay. So Chewy's asked, how many people get engaged with you when you help your clients with projects related to Power BI adoption and governance? The easy statement is to say it's not a job for one or very limited number of people.
Yeah, so most of the time in my career, it's been IT hiring me. So that sort of slanted my experience level. So we've usually got a group of BI team people, 2 to 5 people in the BI team. And then what I like to do is after we've, basically gone through that first 1 to 2 days worth of let's hash through, a couple dozen questions of sorting out what's going on right now. Let's start meeting with some of the other key teams, right? So what you'd want to do is say, have I met with security? Are we clear on what Power BI is doing, et cetera? Have I met with infrastructure, right? Those sorts of things, just to kind of make sure everybody is clear. And sometimes it's just a little bit of education of those teams. So more often than not, I end up going into presentation mode and explaining to them, here's how Power BI works. Because the assumption oftentimes is, oh, this is just another reporting tool that's being rolled out, whatever. And, then we basically need to educate them on, well, it's a little bit more than that. It stores its own data. It refreshes its own data. It has a mobile app, right? And then they get a little more interested.
Okay, and then Gina asked, could you actually approach developing a roadmap at a business unit level instead of enterprise if it's a really large organization?
And I think you'd have to. So that kind of goes back to, if I hop out of here and go and find this thing right here, even if we assess it at the organization level, that doesn't take away the fact that, I'm going to pick on marketing is probably not as advanced as accounting. I know it's a generalization, but you know what I mean in terms of their skills and what they're doing from a data management perspective. And so I think you basically have to, and then, assess where's their maturity level and where do we want them to be, because we can't treat them all the same. And that's where it gets really difficult, because let's say we do have a governance policy for something in particular, such as who may certify content. That one, maybe we can get away with an organization-wide policy. That's possible. But there's other things that we're going to say, all right, accounting, their policy is going to have to be a little bit different than what some other teams are allowed to do.
Okay, great. And so the specific question here, I'm not sure it's Debbie Raoul, but apologies for that. So a more functional question, if they have dozens of workspaces with multiple reports and over time they've shared the report with different users, is there a way to easily get an overview of access to what and improve their insights on who is using what? I think
there
challenge is
is.
the word easily, I think.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
There is a relatively new API that it returns, if you're looking for a specific user, everything that user has access to. If you're looking at it from the other direction, then we'd be saying, well, okay, what's the workspace roles, for instance? But coming at it from the other direction means that we have to marry up workspace roles, app access, and sharing, which can be done. And that's when you want to start using some of the other APIs. The scanner API is the newest one that we talk about most often, where we would get what we would call a workspace inventory. And I like to extract that on either a weekly or a monthly basis to say, as of this point in time, this is what objects existed and who has access to them. But you still got to marry it up with, well, what happened in the activity log, et cetera, et cetera. So I haven't talked to anybody that's actually started running this particular API on a snapshot basis as opposed to just a on-demand kind of basis, but I can almost see that as being useful. But what you're hinting at is getting the security audit data and all of that. It's an effort and takes some time. Plan to not only figure out what data is where, but you'll want to put it in a data model and basically do BI on BI kind of a thing. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes over time.
Okay, that looks like it, unless there's another question. So no, just Catherine shared the Power BI tips, the nice report template for activity logs and so on. And I think there's a couple of other people who have them floating around as well. I think Rui Romano, is it? He has a really good one as well.
Yeah, he really does. He really does. And I
well.
didn't put those resources in here, but I did just want to really quick just mention at the end of the deck, there are, a handful of things that that I think are helpful, especially if we're still thinking at the Power BI adoption roadmap level, that strategic kind of level before we worry details, there's a lot of them.
Yes, yeah, that definitely is. Okay, doesn't look like there are any other questions, so I think we're pretty much finished, just a little bit over. No, brilliant. Thank you very much, Melissa. Brilliant presentation and session as usual. Great content. And for those of you who may not have known who Melissa was previously, I'm not sure how that could even happen, but now you know where to go for questions around governance and adoption of Power BI, definitely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Catherine, for running the group and everything you do as well. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording now as well.